The PlayStation 2 era was definitely among some of the best periods of video games. It gave you everything from movie-inspired games, even titles that were based off of popular music artists and rappers that almost had a movie quality feel and aesthetic to it, all with their own individual stories. And it was a reflection of the time. When you had games like Grand Theft Auto, especially even like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, while they were open world, and you had games like even the Need for Speed games that were racing focused, and they were inspired by the likes of the Fast and Furious movies. While a lot of these elements all had similar characteristics and traits, so we'd end up predominantly seeing a flood of different types of titles reach the market on the system that would appeal to so many different fans of music, TV, film, you name the like, that all featured a lot of the favourite characters that we were all familiar with at the time. Even with rap, for at the time, was thriving. And even going back when I was at college at the time, there was rap music all the time. 50 Cent in particular was the new upcoming artist at the time, and he was a big deal. Like, his first album alone speaks volumes of how good the music was. And if you were a young person back then, that's what you listened to. So quite naturally a game was going to be made that featured the character under 50 Cent, Bulletproof, that would see release on the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox in 2005 and later on the PSP in 2006. The game itself would also get a sequel on the PlayStation 3 later on with 50 Cent, Blood on the Sand. And the game would focus around third person action and adventure that utilised run and gun gameplay mechanics and even cover systems as you progress through all of the game's levels to defeat as many enemies as you possibly can, utilising a silly amount of weapons at your disposal in order to dispatch enemies. And the plot focuses around 50 himself trying to go on the hunt to track down those that left him for dead so that he can take his revenge. But what's really cool about this game is that it has its own interesting story, dialogue, voice acting. It almost is like an original movie, as it also features other well-known rappers and characters from both the G-Unit crew themselves, but even with Dr. Dre, Eminem and a few others, all playing distinctive characters that would be important to the storyline of the game, even with their own voices as well from those original characters, I think, which is very, very cool. When the game released, right, it was mixed. In some cases it got very good reviews, in other cases it got mixed average, I think because of the gameplay style. But at the time there was a massive influx of these type of games coming out with action. A lot of them were focused on gameplay styles that would have been familiar with the likes of Grand Theft Auto, but even if you look at Max Payne for instance, I know while it is slightly a different game to a degree, but the 3D gun style mechanics would become a predominant feature in a lot of these action adventure games moving forward. And it seemed to be an easy thing to use when you were creating games, or when companies were creating games that wanted to mix in action adventure, but when they wanted to implement and endorse very popular and trending characters of the time, it seemed to be a no-brainer of a way to just create a game around that type of style, where it's based like in run down streets and areas, almost like HUD kind of environments. But I always loved these type of games. I always thought the aesthetic of it, the atmosphere, the ambience and just the environments themselves, I always thought was very, very cool. It always put me in mind of other games I would play later on with the likes of Final Fight Streetwise from Capcom, Beatdown, Fists of Vengeance. A lot of beat 'em ups also had a lot of these visual aesthetics and just gameplay elements as well, which I thought was really, really cool. Right, while the game didn't get great reviews, it does have a fairly decent story to a degree, even though it is very linear in how it approaches itself. But I think there's enough dialogue that makes it funny but yet serious at the same time. But let's just put it this way, when it comes to the violence aspect of it, this game really is over the top. Like, it's insane. Like, even with the likes of the final kills when you're taking out enemies, some of the ways that you can finish them off is quite out there, if you will. It's very over the top. But there was a lot of games that were like this that were coming out at the time. A lot of games even tried to replicate the gameplay features seen in this game as well, that would come out a year or so later. But yeah, it was just an interesting time for video games. Regardless of the reviews though, the game did sell in fairly decent numbers, definitely making a good bit of money. And even for the year of 2006, the game itself would be among the top 100 selling games of the PlayStation 2 during that time. So to say that it's bad wouldn't really be a thing, but at the same time you also have to remember the popular character behind the game as well, so that in itself would have helped sell a bucket load of titles as well. And that was also a key feature for a lot of games to sell on the PlayStation 2 during that time. While a lot of these games were never considered great, they also did have unique aspects and gameplay features, while some of them felt a bit repetitive because you've seen one, you've seen them all to a degree. Yeah, they did have that dynamic dynamic to it, I will admit. But it was interesting because, yeah, they did reference and were heavily influenced by other titles like it, but they did manage to do enough just to put their own spin on it too. And the fact is that you had well-known characters and artists, it just added to the appeal. Even with their individual stories, almost made it feel more relatable to a degree as well, in many ways. But after some time of playing the game, we will admit though, after a while it does get a little bit on the repetitive side, because again, the approach to the level design is very linear. It's literally just keep defeating waves of enemies and solving a few puzzles, maybe entering a password or flicking a switch in order to do something or move something so that you can proceed to the next area, and then defeat a couple of bosses along the way. So it is pretty much rinse and repeat, and you will find that. So if that's not your thing, it probably won't be the game for you, but it definitely would have appealed to a lot back then. Even for myself, one of my younger brothers got this as a Christmas present around that time in 2005, not long after the game was released, and I do remember particularly playing this for a while on Christmas Day. My brothers playing it as well, and they really liked it, they enjoyed it. And the fact is, we were all big fans of listening to the 50 Cent album as well, because I was at college too. So at the time it was just a cool way to interact with video games, that you had that medium from seeing favourite TV characters or artists, but in a video game predominantly. So essentially it would have made the characters a lot more relatable, I'll admit that, to be honest. But yeah, I do remember my brothers putting a good bit of time into this, and they enjoyed it for what it was. While the game probably hasn't aged as well, it is a reflection of its time period. There was a lot of games like this that were popping up around that time, but I think the PlayStation 2 was the most rebellious period in video games, I have to admit. There were so many ideas like this that were out there, and they weren't afraid to take liberties with their ideas, their concepts, even with the level of violence that were being portrayed in video games at the time, because again, it was a very touchy subject, and this period marked a move that really pushed that narrative even further, almost to the limit of how far they could get away with. And in many cases they did. When you had titles like this that were on that spectrum to a degree, they really did push the boat out in terms of video game violence and just narratives overall, even with storytelling and everything in between. While they may not have been the best games of their type, they definitely made up for it in other avenues. But yeah, I think it's a lost art. When you look at games today, don't get me wrong, like games today in many cases are phenomenal, like they're stunning looking, they have great narratives, great storytelling, but a lot of them follow a similar kind of aesthetic, and it's all about the final thing about making money. While yes, essentially the main goal is for a company to make money from the games that they put out there, but oftentimes many games just miss the mark. There's always something missing from them that just can't be replicated. And when you look back at these earlier generations with the likes of the PlayStation 2, even the PS1 before it, there were just so many games that came out during those times that left a mark that is indistinguishable from anything else out there, that realistically we've never been able to witness. Even my own personal opinion, I've been playing games for almost 40 years and pretty much giving my way with my age at this point, and literally there's been very few times where games have literally just left me just in awe and just left a lasting impact in the way that a lot of these titles have. But if you grew up during that period like I did, you would understand that. Maybe not so much for the younger generation of today, they do probably find it harder to understand that. Now in saying that, there are people out there that do prefer the older games, which I personally do, and these are the games I will go back and play quicker than anything else. And the cool thing now with emulation and even with game formats nowadays, there are so many games out there that we never got to experience back then. Even for myself personally, there are a crap ton of games out there that I would have wanted to play back in the day, but you either couldn't afford it, they weren't available in your area, you just didn't have the money to buy them because your life got in the way, you were trying to make ends meet, you were at college, you were trying to save money, or you were going out partying at the weekends, and then you were playing games in your off time, but you didn't always have the money to buy games like this that were the thing, or the popular thing back then. You usually had to wait until they came down cheap, but even at that, trying to find it later on was always quite difficult. But still, I just think it's a very cool time for video games. This game is just but one reflection of that. There were so many others out there that just stood out. While yes, they're definitely not the best games out there, but they did leave an impact like no other. There's just something very interesting and unique about these generations from the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 that just modern eras just cannot seem to replicate. Now, it's not to say the games are bad, there's some incredible games that are being made today, but a lot of them just lack something that just, I don't know, I can't put my name on it. I think a lot of other people have mentioned that before, from other videos I've watched on YouTube as well. There is something missing that we just can't seem to get anymore. I think because a lot of it has to do as well with games now always being demanded under a paywall, that you only get like a certain percentage of the game, but in order to gain access to everything the game has to offer, you have to keep paying and paying and paying, which isn't appealing in the long run. Whereas back then, with the likes of this, and then even with the PS3 would have started all that trend. But the PS2 generation was the last dominant era where you got full game, you got got the full package and that was it. Like, there was no add-ons, there was no pay money for extra content or whatever. What would end up happening is, if that was the case, the game would be re-released, like say even for example like Midnight Club 3 like dub edition, or there'd be a couple of games in a similar trait that they would re-release the game but add in all new features, they would tweak the gameplay. That would be essentially like an update but be classed as an individual game, and people would go out and buy it just for that, which you didn't mind, because if the game was good like those games, well, you didn't care. But you didn't have the pressure that you have today with games now, just constantly buy and buy and buy. Literally, games like 50 Cent Bulletproof, what you see is what you get, and that's the appeal to it. If I'll be honest, that's what made them even more fun and more enjoyable in a way, even though they weren't the best games, but they were still a lot of fun. So it is what you make of it at the end of the day. May not appeal to everybody, but it definitely will appeal to some, and I did enjoy these games back in the day and I still enjoy them today. But with that being said, I would love to know your thoughts of this, even just the whole concept of even what I've been speaking about here in this video as well, around these type of games, and what did they bring to your life when you were playing them, what did you think about them overall. So be sure to share it down in the comments below, and if you would like to see more content around other types of games like 50 Cent Bulletproof, which I have already covered on the channel, then I have plenty of them here which you can check out in this playlist.